tonight, I just want to know how many of you woke up this morning and said, oh boy, I can't wait until our Safe Sanctuary training. That's right. That's right. Well,
I was like,
that could be. No, well, I know that, and some of you have been here before. I was able to be here a couple of years ago, and it's good to see you back again. This is one of those things that is very important in the life of the church, but it's not probably one of the things, again, that we wake up and go, oh boy, I can't wait. But I'm going to try to make it as informal as possible while covering all the important things. But I also want you, if there are particular questions that you have or a situation that you want to ask about, be sure to ask about that. This will be the full training, but it'll be shorter than some. I've been a part of some trainings before that are like 3 hours and they just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And unless y'all are having trouble catching on, I won't do that. But again, if you have questions, please ask. But I'd like to open with a word of prayer, first of all. Lord God, we give you thanks. We thank you for this day and for all that is a part of it. And we thank you for these people who have gathered here, who have taken time because they love their church, because they love serving in ministry. And oh God, as we gather tonight, we ask a special blessing upon Wayner and ask for your hand of healing upon him. Surround Wayner and Joanna with your arms of comfort and provide for them just what they need. Oh God, we thank you and we praise your holy name. Amen. All right. Just to kind of get an understanding of who all you are, how many of you are here because you are in ministry with children, or in particular Vacation Bible School, I understand, is coming up? So how many of you children is a part of your ministry? Okay, and how many of you teenagers, perhaps? Anybody? How many of you with vulnerable adults? Okay, there are a couple of you. And then are there some of you that are here from another church? Wayner had said that there might be. Oh, okay. And they made you sit by me.
That's right.
That was planned.
Good, okay. No, I think that's great to have others that are a part of
So
that.
I can add a little bit to that. We have a literacy camp coming up a week after Bible school, so I think that's probably where Ms. Clapville comes in. And then we do have some other members from another church that are going to be helping us.
Okay.
But I don't think they can be here.
Okay, good. Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, that kind of helps me know where especially to target. I wanted to start off with some scripture. I think it's always important when we gather as the church. And in particular from Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. As we think about why we're here and why safe sanctuary policies and procedures are important. From Galatians chapter 5, it is absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use this freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want to do and destroy your freedom. Rather, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's how freedom grows. For everything we know about God's Word is summed up in a single sentence: love others as you love yourself. And I think that's an important foundation for us as we think about why do we have safe sanctuary policies and procedures. Many of you already know that in 1996 at General Conference in the United Methodist Church, they adopted a resolution that was aimed at that time to reduce the risk of harm for children and youth in the United Methodist Church. And as a part of that, later on, the addition of vulnerable adults was added. And in your, and I think everybody has a copy of your policies. Is there anybody that needs one? Okay. There's a definition on the second page about who the children, youth, and vulnerable adult categories are as I'm talking about it. And children are birth through age 12. Sometimes it changes a little bit depending on how churches break down the children's division and the youth division. But youth age 13 to 18, and then vulnerable adults is a category that was added later with the understanding that there are many in the church who are not of young age, but could be of any age, who are considered vulnerable adults. And that is a person 18 or older who is mentally, physically, or psychologically challenged and unable to make responsible decisions about his or her own welfare. It also is a category that includes those who may be elderly, defined, and I don't know about this particular category as I'm getting closer to that age, but defined as age 65 or older. The idea again being to do all we can as a church to protect those who are more vulnerable, whether they are young children or whether they are handicapped in some way where they are not able to care fully for themselves, or if they are elderly and again not able to fully care for themselves. So that in mind, part of the resolution was that God calls all of us to make our churches safe places. And I'm reading part of your Bryson City policy under the introduction, and this is the last paragraph of that first introduction. That God calls us to make our churches safe places, protecting children and other vulnerable persons from sexual and ritual abuse. God calls us to create communities of faith where children and adults grow safe and strong. And I'd like for us together to read the statement of covenant, because this is something that you all, as a church, are saying that you will do. And if you see it, it's right under the purpose there, and it says statement of covenant. And let's read that together.
Therefore, as a Christian community of faith and a united Methodist congregation, we pledge to conduct the ministry of the gospel in ways that assure the safety and spiritual growth of all children and youth, as well as the workers with children and youth. We will follow reasonable safety measures in the selection and recruitment of event staff. We will implement prudent operational procedures in all programs and events. We will educate all our children and youth workers regarding the use of all appropriate policies and methods. We will have a clearly defined procedure for reporting a suspected incident of abuse that conforms to the requirements of state law, and we will be prepared to respond to media inquiries if an incident occurs.
Thank you. So you all have made that pledge as a part of your church, as a part of your churches, to do all you can to keep people safe. And that includes you. And so as a part of what we'll be going through are things to keep children, youth, and vulnerable adults safe, but also those who are in ministry with them. As you know well, we have become a very litigious society where oftentimes people think the best way is to file a lawsuit. And so part of this is to help prevent those kinds of things. But again, it's also to prevent any harm coming from anyone, really. And so as we go through, there are specific things that are a part of your procedures that we want to make sure that everybody is aware of. For some of you that especially have already been in ministry with children and youth and vulnerable adults for a while, some of this is just going to be a review. For others, it may be something new. And so again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I want to turn to the second page of your procedures, where you all have set aside the understanding that you require a minimum 2-person rule. And what that means is that there should always be at least 2 adults present in any ministry setting with children and youth in a church-sponsored program. The preference is, although you have said in your policies it's not required, that the 2 adults be unrelated by blood or marriage. The reason for that, sometimes people say, well, why is that? Oftentimes it's, maybe a married couple or a mother and a daughter or a brother and a sister who are serving as leaders in the ministry. The idea is that if ever there was anything that came under question, oftentimes family members don't want to do something that would harm their spouse or their sibling or whatever. But again, in your policies, you've said that's preferred, but it's not required. The reality is, how many of you are serving in ministry with a family member? Several of you, okay? That's how it is. I mean, my husband and I have taught youth Sunday school together for many years. But again, the idea is to do as much as you can to make for a safe environment. And so, what you have said in your policy, and I say this in terms of what you all have said, because this is the policy that Bryson City United Methodist Church has adopted. Churches have some flexibility. There are some churches that have a 4-adult minimum. There are some churches that say you can be 21 or older. Some churches say to be in ministry with younger children, you have to be 25 or older. There's some specifics related to just your church. But what you have said is 2 adults in a classroom, or oftentimes there might be 1 adult in the classroom with somebody we call a roamer. And a roamer would be still covering the safe sanctuary policy, with the idea that perhaps you had 3 different groups of children and there would be 1 adult with each of the groups. The door would be open into the classroom or the room where they are, but then there would be another adult roaming around that could fulfill that part of your policy. The whole idea behind having that is to cover the bases so that if ever someone came back and said, I'm just going to use an example of a 10-year-old girl who said, Mr. So-and-so did something that bothered me, or so-and-so touched me inappropriately. If there was another adult there, they would be able to say, no, that did not happen, they were never alone by themselves, those kind of things. So again, it is for protection for the children and youth, but it's also protection for you. So you all have said there are 2 adults in a classroom or 1 adult with a roamer, and that this is to cover not only the Sunday morning activities, but anything that happens on your church property, or if not on your church property, anytime one of your church groups is somewhere. Does anybody have a question about that?
I do have a question. Yeah. Since you talk about being on church property, and I do work with vulnerable adults, so a woman who is intoxicated, who has been just gone through a domestic violence situation, and I have brought her on church property to try to get it rectified and take care of her. Having 4 men present would not be a good thing
Right,
to do. There should be always a female there present.
right,
Which,
yeah,
and if 2 of those are law enforcement who insist on locking themselves in a room with this individual and her under the influence and have just gone through this, a female should be present. Yeah, that's why I'm.
that's, yeah, so
Because
it's,
this happened to me,
okay,
and so we picked her up. She had been involved in a domestic violence. She was under the influence. We brought her here, and they did not have a female on the force, and so I stayed with her to protect her rights, so she could not, accuse the officers for one. And I
Right.
told the officers, look, I am staying here because she's under the influence. She's also been very traumatized. She's in a very shock situation, and I says, I need to stay. I mean, they worked with me. They was really
okay,
good.
I was
They
gonna
was
ask
really
if
good,
they-
but
they were.
and this, I know that we're having to look now at a situation type scenario, but and then anytime you have something like that, there should be a female present.
Well, and there is something that talks about in here, I can't identify it right off the top, but there is something that says males and females.
Talks about overnight trips, that there should be a,
Yeah, okay,
And
okay.
the
But I
supervision's
was
on
thinking
line
there was
4.
something else that said, anyway, it's, even if it's not specifically in the policy, it is good practice.
Which
to
is something I
have-
just thought it
yeah.
should be brought up here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I'm glad that they cooperated with that. And I think you could always say, if not, our church requires
Yeah.
someone of the same sex to be there.
Well, I
So-
was really concerned about the police officers in this case because of the fact that she was so far gone and so far high on
Yeah.
substances that I was afraid that she would try to implicate them. And then
Right.
having 2 men in there would have not.
Yeah, no, and that's a good
Okay.
point to bring up. And that just reminds me to say, common sense too is a factor. And so when something doesn't feel comfortable, then make sure that you either speak up or you say, I need to have another adult in here or whatever. I'm on page 3 now, going through your policy, and you've got the 5 years older rule. And that says that the adults who, and here's the key word, supervise the activities for children and youth should be at least 5 years older than that children or youth. Now, what that does not mean is that you can't have a younger helper in there. Because oftentimes some of the best Vacation Bible School helpers might be just a year or 2 older, but they would not be in a supervising position. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, and I think you all pretty much have windows in all your classrooms and in the doors. That is something, the idea behind that is you never want to put yourself or to put a child or a youth in a setting where there are no windows, where it is a locked room under the staircase, or a room where nobody would even know that anyone was there, because that unfortunately is oftentimes where things can happen that can harm a child. So just if you are in a classroom and there should not be a window in the door, just leave the door open. Again, to protect you as well as the children and the youth. There's some things in here that I know Wayne is already well aware of. We have to go through these yearly trainings as well. But sometimes people say, well, I have a confidential matter that I want to discuss. And you can still discuss confidential matters with the door shut, but with the window. Or to alert someone else have someone else in the church office and say, I'm getting ready to have a confidential meeting with someone, and just so somebody else is aware. And again, to protect whoever's doing the pastoral counseling as well as whoever has come in. Another thing to think about is to always give parents or guardians of children and youth advance notice. I know when I was growing up, one of my favorite Sunday school teachers, often spur of the moment, and I later, as I grew up, realized that he probably just hadn't prepared a Sunday school lesson. But he often would say, let's go to the donut place down the street. And of course, we loved going to the donut place. But that probably was not the best idea, because I can still remember my parents coming after Sunday school and we weren't there, and they wondered where we were. So always with children and youth, the advance written notice, make sure that they know, make sure that there are details given, and that there is a number that parents can reach you in case of an emergency, but also then you would have the information that they would fill out for the forms. And I don't know, do you all usually, for children and youth, do you have them fill out one form kind of for several activities, or do you do it one? Okay. Yeah, because as a parent, I always hated it when you had to fill out a form every single time for something. But that's to be determined depending on what you're doing, and periodically asking the parents or the guardians, is there any information that needs to be updated or anything like that. And you've got in here about having the permission forms for each child or youth to travel with. The other thing is to have 2 adults stay until all the children are picked up. Is that an issue from time to time? Or, that's good. I've had some times where parents didn't come for hours. Okay. So again, the idea is not to have one adult hanging out with a teenager after everybody else has gone, and it could be a long time before they're picked up. Then as we move into the housing, and this is for trips with children and youth, no child or youth shall be housed alone with an adult. Now that doesn't mean that you can't, oftentimes in a hotel, you may be traveling, or in a dorm on a retreat or something where you might have the adults in the same room with the youth or the children. But you would never just have one adult with the children, and you would not have the adult sharing a bed with a child unless it were a parent, like that. So does anybody have any questions about that? Are there any situations that have come up for those of y'all that take them on trips? Anything that's unusual, or did you have questions about?
I have another question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So with this 5-year older rule where you was talking about, you having helpers and stuff within the classroom, what is the lowest age that you would have as far as background checks? Say if you had a teenager. So I mean, we have teenagers that are at risk within the high school. So what is the lowest age you would do a background check for these?
So most places I've done, when I have had helpers that were under the age of 18, I still did a background check just because we require everyone to have a background check. But I knew that there would not be anything shown on there, but it was still a part of just the record keeping.
So you're down to the one church where this is going to be a joint church type of situation, so if there was, I'm not saying there is, I'm just saying if the situation should occur and there was a 16 or 17-year-old kid that came in from another church who was gonna be a helper, should there not be a background check?
So I would still do a background check, and I would also have, if it's not somebody that you know, there's, and I think on your forms here, there's something that has like some references. If, yeah. So, how many of you would that affect? Is it,
We had
Okay.
talked about having volunteers from the high school or even the middle school help with the literacy camp.
okay,
That would be referred by, we actually think about a couple of organizations that do volunteer work as well.
okay, okay. So you may want to think about, is there some kind of form that you would have, like one of their teachers or their counselor or somebody fill out too? Again, the more that you can show with record keeping or with, that you have done due diligence in checking out everybody who's gonna be helping. But knowing that a 15-year-old, you're not really gonna have much of a background check, for that. And
that minors may be with an adult.
Always.
right,
Always.
right, yeah, you would always have an adult with them, yeah, yeah. So, let's see. Again, just with the housing on a trip, no co-ed, we've always said, pink is where the girls are, blue is where the guys are, and this is very categorical, so. But when you put pink and purple, and we put pink and blue together, it's purple, and we don't want purple in the youth trips. And so our youth would always say, no purpling. But again, just to make clear, the boundaries, and that, again, not to put young people in a spot where they could feel compromised or something. And then in terms of medical forms, making sure that everybody, and one of the things I will tell you all that lately we have found with our just regular church events is that we have more and more people in our church who live alone, who have their family lives far away, and if something were to happen where they collapsed at an event or something, we might not know who to get in touch with. And so we're trying to gather more information, and in particular, and I may have shared this with you all before, I didn't have the original, so this is a blacked out copy, but I'll leave it with you all, that we do for especially older adult trips and things, but it's really for any adult, and it's called the Luke Registry because Luke was a physician. And the idea is that people can fill these out, and sometimes people are a little uncomfortable about listing medical conditions or medications. So this is filled out but put in an envelope with their name on the front, so that when they go on a trip, if ever they needed the information, they could then open up and have the information. So that's just something if you all would like to.
We looked at this one and we wrote this policy.
Okay, yeah,
Something
I was thinking that I had shared that with you all before, but again, we're finding more and more that we need to have a little bit more information. But again, it may not be information that needs to be anywhere unless there was an emergency. So something to just think about that. Also, insurance companies are really cracking down on wanting accident reports. And so if you all aren't doing that on a regular, but hopefully you're not having a lot of accidents. But whenever there is something to fill out, whether you have a form or just somehow documenting what happened, when and where it happened, who else was there, who saw it, and then what action was taken. And that is something that often in the midst of, if somebody has fallen down, you're more concerned about helping them and you want to help them, but also after the incident, make sure that an accident report is filled out.
I think we have those forms, if I'm correct.
Okay, I was thinking that you did. Then on page 4, as I'm thinking about conduct, you all have put in here, anything that's illegal is not going to be a part of what's acceptable. So, you know, that covers that. But you've also put in here, and I'm looking at number 2, participants are to treat others as they would want to be treated, to encourage positive, nurturing relationships within the whole group without the use of profane language, without practical jokes that may be harmful, without any 2 children or youth, or 1 child or youth and 1 adult separating themselves from the group in isolated locations, without inappropriate demonstrations of affection and physical contact. And so, again, when you are, especially with about to go on a trip, one of the things I think is really important is to put the expectations out there of how we are going to treat one another. I have always said, when we go somewhere, if you have a church van or a church bus or something, or T-shirts, it says where you're coming from, and so if you behave inappropriately, everybody's going to know. So you want to behave in a way that represents the church well. But also that includes not harming other people's belongings or other people's self-esteem and saying negative things to them. And usually when you put those expectations out there, not in a negative way of saying, no, 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 don't do that, but if you put out in a positive way how we're going to treat one another as we go on this trip or as we do this project together, children and youth will usually rise to the occasion, but they need to know what's expected of them. So taking that into account before you have an event or trip or anything. Also talks about how children, youth, adult participants, and all staff will be expected to observe all policies, guidelines, and covenants of the event. I can still remember when I was in high school and we had one of our youth counselors who thought he didn't need to follow all the rules and got drunk on a youth trip. He was no longer a counselor after that. But I can remember as a teenager thinking, that's not good, and you know, that's just not how we are to be. And sometimes I have been at other gatherings with other youth groups where there have been some adults who acted like they were beyond and above and better than the rules. And so if the adults aren't following the guidelines and what's expected, then you certainly can't expect the children to do so. So watch out about misbehaving. Clothing for all is expected to be modest and appropriate, including swimsuits. That's very general. So, you know, you may need to decide, do you need to be clearer? Sometimes when you go on youth mission trips with other groups, sometimes they're very specific about girls must wear a one-piece swimsuit, or guys must also wear a t-shirt over their, you know, swimsuit or something. So again, that's purposely, I think, general, but you decide what you need to set forth as the expectations. I've always told my youth, don't wear things that body parts are gonna be hanging out of that aren't your arms and legs or your head. So, just keep that in mind. And I one time had one of the youth counselors that I had to hand a t-shirt to put on over her swimsuit. So, just again, you're representing the church. You want to represent it in a positive way, but that's for the leaders to decide. When you travel in a car, do you all usually have like parents driving or the leaders driving, or how do you, if you're taking children or youth somewhere, do you?
We sometimes use the van, but I mean, we don't really go on many trips hardly
Okay.
ever.
Okay,
So,
okay.
I
So
mean,
that-
parents will drive and, you know,
Yeah.
there's always at least 3 or 4 adults if the van goes. And,
Okay, okay.
All the ones I've been on are in the van, so.
So, yeah. And so again, just making sure that you've covered that. Sometimes people have asked, what if we're going, like if you all were meeting at the church and then going to Deep Creek or something, and you had 3 cars going and only 3 adults. As long as you all are you know, close together and you're leaving at the same time, arriving at the same time, and you can pretty much see each other, then that does not allow for the opportunity for one of the drivers to take one of the youth off somewhere. So in those kinds of instances, you know, again, use common sense, but also know that you want to protect both the adults and the children. One of the questions that you might want to think about that's not reflected in your policy is when you're having events for children and youth, what about when there's shared custody? Are there guidelines for who's going to pick up? Some churches say whoever brings them is the one to pick up, but that's not always practical, or that, you know, so would you have written permission, or the person who brings them, would they have written permission? So something for you all to think about is how would you do that? I know sometimes I've experienced where there might be some difficulty going on in the family, and whoever brings them says very clearly, I do not want so-and-so to pick them up. And I've always said, I need to have that in writing, and, you know, those kind of
The
things.
school system has those kind of cards. When I had my 2 daughters in hiding, we had to literally have a card with the picture of that individual
Okay.
that was not allowed to pick up the child because there was the next part they order against them.
Okay, yeah. So those are things to consider. Also, some questions about your background checks and how, are you doing them for everyone? Are you doing them every, how many years? What?
Every 2 years for everyone.
Okay.
Anyone participating in any event with any children. I mean, that could be people who are working in the kitchen cooking, maybe they're not directly involved with the children, but we're still requiring them to have background checks.
Okay, good. Yeah, and if you're doing them every 2 years, that's great. Now, they're recommending every 3 to 4 years. But it covers your bases even more to do that.
I don't think we put it in the first.
Okay, that's good, yeah.
What about when you coming in and do them right away for your volunteers? It's not like you do it every day. You would do it right away, right?
We would ask that.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. And you may decide it doesn't need to be in your policy, but just being aware of having a regular, let's go through and we need to update. And what about driver's license checks?
We have to have copies of those on file,
Okay.
current copies.
Okay.
With our signing of the covenant, of our covenants and their background check, we have a copy of their license.
Okay, good. And one of the things that we've just discovered is, we have a number of our people who are on our list to drive our church van and our church bus, but they're aging out. And there are certain requirements that insurance companies have about that, so just know what your insurance company requires for that. And oftentimes, they will, if you have a letter from the doctor at a certain age, and it depends, a lot of insurance companies say, like, you can still drive a church vehicle between 70 and 74, but you have to have a doctor's note saying that you're in good health to be able to do that. So whatever your insurance company, but that's just always something to check on. And then your reporting in cases of abuse, you all have a very set, here's what happens, and that you would first contact if there was any incident. And I always tell people, even if you're not sure if it's really an incident, if there's just something that you just feel uncomfortable with, go ahead and tell your pastor. That's what you have on here, is to tell your pastor. And then in the event that your pastor is the one that you want to file the complaint about, then you would notify the Staff Parish Relations Committee Chair and the district superintendent within 24 hours. So you all have a set, here's what happens. And then
How do you find out who those people are?
who those
Something
people
happens. Is there something somewhere you can
So,
look it up?
who is your Staff Parish Relations Chair? Okay. Okay, so that, and then Linda Kelly is the district superintendent for the Smoky Mountain District. Yeah. And then also in here is how to handle the media. And like Linda Kelly as your district superintendent has been trained in how do we handle anything that comes up where she would need to talk with the media or whoever the district superintendent is. And then you have on here in number 6, well, and then number 5, let me just mention that either the pastor or the trustees chair would contact the insurance immediately, again, to cover all the bases. Then number 6 says that if there is a complaint or anyone who is named as an alleged offender, they would need to immediately be required to cease any contact with children or youth through Bryson City UMC while the complaint is under investigation or anything like that. Before I talk about some other things, I did want to ask, so those of you that work with vulnerable adults, are there any of you who go out into homes and visit, especially some of the elderly maybe? Okay. A couple of things to keep in mind is that oftentimes vulnerable adults, and especially elderly, can have different types of abuse that you might not be aware of normally, but you might notice if you were to go to their house. And those are things like, could be physical abuse if you see more and more bruising. Now some of that could be just falling on their own or being clumsy like I am. But it could also be that somebody is hurting them, grabbing them or shaking them or something. There's also financial abuse, and being aware of if somebody keeps saying, I don't have the money to pay for the lights, but then you see that their son, for example, who lives in the house, as a new car or something like that. Those are just little things to think about. Is if there's something not right. You can also see perhaps evidence of neglect, and that's withholding the basic necessities of life. If you see that perhaps they're not getting their food or things like that, they're not, you go in and there's a strong smell of urine there, and you realize that nobody is taking care of those needs. Those are kinds of things to pay attention to. But also, there are times when you're going to visit someone that you may want somebody to go with you. And that's where often still the same two-person rule is a good thing, because you might go to visit an older adult who has dementia, and they, in their, 5 years ago, you might have gone to visit them, or they might have been here at church all the time, and you had a very good relationship with them. But you might go visit them, and in their declining condition, they may think that you're there to harm them. Or they may call up someone and say, so-and-so was here and she hit me or something, when in fact that didn't happen. But if you didn't have somebody else there. So again, don't put yourself in a position, even when you're not in the church building, just to know that the two-person rule is often a good thing. And especially if you're working with some of those that you are.
Yeah.
And we've just had a conversation with some of the folks in our choir, because we have a homeless woman in our choir who sometimes is doing very well and other times is not. And she can get totally out of control really quickly. And we have often had people who want to take her, to the drugstore or something like that. But what we've said is 2 of you take her, because you just don't know what might happen. And again, to have that two-person rule.
And one of the things, because I work with the police over in Jackson County and social services over there now, they're telling us when we do go knock on the door, do not go in front of the door and knock onto it. Actually stand to the side, because if you have a drug addict who is in one of his states, he may decide to shoot through the door. So they're now telling us to stand to the side and do something of that sort.
Okay.
So that is, it's to protect yourself.
Right.
And try to identify yourself and tell them you're not the police, for sure. So I do some of that stuff in Jackson.
Okay. And that's, unfortunately, we have to learn those things and be aware of that kind of stuff. At this point, I'm going to stop for just a minute to see, are there any questions or something that you're thinking, well, how could that be, or what if, how should I respond to this? Anything? Okay. Yeah.
For the people who might meet outside of church, and like the ones who are saying that people might come financially, or where do you go to for these spectrum?
Well, I would first talk to Wayner or whoever's leading your whatever program you're doing. But then social services, and I don't know who in this county would you?
Carol Manning.
Oh, okay.
She's trying to hide.
She's hiding, yes. So any comments on
Just
that?
call the office and say you have a report that you need to make, and identify whether it's an adult or a child.
Okay.
And you can do
and
it
you
anonymous,
provide the
right?
information, yeah.
Yeah.
You provide the information, they'll decide whether it's rise to the level of
Right.
adult abuse or neglect.
Yeah.
Or a welfare check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do
in
welfare.
a welfare check,
checks.
yes. I've had to do that
For adults, not
recently
children.
several times
Okay,
of
yeah, children.
children who live far away who have been trying to get in touch with their parents and couldn't reach them. And sometimes they've been just not wanting to talk to their children, but other times they have been in distress or something. Somebody had fallen and had been laying there for 2 days, and so those are things I always think. For me, if there is something in your gut that says there's just something not right here, that it's far better to be proactive and to make the appropriate call, or to, again, pull another adult in with you or whatever, to think about that.
You talked about no purple, but what do you do about transgender people now?
Okay, I know, that's a good question. And that's something to talk about among the leaders of how to do that. There's some retreat centers who now are saying, we've got the boys dorm, the girls dorm, the transgender dorm, whatever. And so that's one of those things to take into account. I think so, very, very important. And again, one of the things when you're leading ministries is you want all to find their place and to feel welcome, and to feel safe. And so to be able to provide that. What else? Other questions? Okay. I think we've talked about the procedures and how to report things. Another thing to think about is how would you decide to care for the alleged victim as well as the perpetrator and their families? And that's something, oftentimes, if a situation happens within a church and it's immediately reported and it goes through all the channels, but then the perpetrator at the time has family members too that are a part of the church. And so think about how you respond as a loving church to them as well. So that doesn't have to necessarily be a part of your policy, but just to think about how, because that, unfortunately, that happens, and many times there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of repercussions, and how can you minister to those who are affected by it? I'm just looking to make sure. There is something that is called Jessica's Law, and it is an addendum that we added to our policy. That happened in, I think, 2008. But, and I'd be happy to lead this if you all want to look at it further. But what Jessica was, it's the Jessica Lunsford Act for North Carolina that was effective 12/1/2008. And Jessica Lunsford was someone who, I can't remember if she was killed, but she was sexually assaulted. And the idea is that if ever there would be someone who is a registered sex offender who wants to come to your church, do you have things in place where you would still be a welcoming church, but you would set guidelines? For example, what we have said in our church is that a registered sex offender shall not be in attendance in any church event where the primary audience is children or youth or for vulnerable adults. However, they could come into a worship service that would be all ages. But as a part of that, a registered sex offender must come and register with the church. And then we would assign someone who would be there with them the whole time that they are there for the worship service. Okay. have
We've
you-
talked about it, but I don't know if it's in our
Okay.
policy.
We have the forms, it's all on there.
I don't know what
Okay.
we did.
I don't think we, I think,
We have the forms.
Okay. Okay.
So we have a record of what we talked about. Well, that's good. We
Okay.
just have to review it maybe.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I know in 2 churches that I've served, we have had some, in one case, two different people who have come, who want to be a part of a church. And, but you want to, again, keep the children and youth safe. And so just having an idea of how you would respond to that and how, and we did have one who did not follow the guidelines. And he would come in down by the children's area, and we had to tell him, I'm sorry, but you cannot come anymore if you cannot follow the guidelines.
so who would be privy to the sex offender coming into the church if this policy is in place? Would the whole church know?
No, not necessarily, no.
Because, I mean, like you're saying, there's confidentiality and rules in place for
Right.
this individual as well, so.
Right. Yeah, now, when we've done it, it's only been the pastors who knew, and then the person that was asked
To
to
kind of
be with
their
them.
charge.
And that's what we said.
Yeah.
And we would have, the pastor would know, and then he would appoint an adult.
Okay.
To
Yeah.
select that person on.
Right. Yeah. That is what I am to cover, but I want to make sure, and I told you all it would be short. So we've done it like 55 minutes. But I want to make sure that if you have questions or if there's something that needs further clarification, anything else?
So follow up with the Genesis law, are you saying that the Genesis law for the state of North Carolina, that any registered sex offender must also disclose to the pastors, or is
Well-
that a church policy?
It is, I can't tell you the whole, the law is a registered sex offender shall not be within 300 feet of any location intended primarily for the use, care, or supervision of minors. However, they could attend on church property, but a registered sex offender must be accompanied by an unrelated same-gender adult covenant partner provided by the church. Now, one of the things that I know is that it is up to them, they're supposed to come contact you. However, that may not always.
Right,
Yeah,
so if
really.
they disclose that, then,
So,
you know, you're not gonna go
then-
and check online every single person
No,
that comes to
no,
your church, right? So-
No.
But that's the
No.
reason for background checks.
Background check, right, background checks would reveal something like that. But also, if someone were to say, well, I know so-and-so has been in jail before, or they're on probation, then what I would do is I would be proactive and I would contact their probation officer and say, and there's confidentiality there, but I would say, I need to know if there was any kind of sexual offender charge or anything like that. But again, if you did, but you wouldn't do a background check necessarily on someone who was just coming to church. So,
You could do an internet search of, within
Right.
a mile of the church, or
Right.
10 miles of the church,
yeah,
that lists where they live.
Mhm.
I'm reading it right here, this Jessica's law, and they said because of there may be family members connected to that sex offender, that it would only stay with the sex offender, the pastor, and with the charge, the person that would be responsible for them, because the family carries the stigmatism of that person who's committed the crime as well.
Right, right, yeah, and again, that goes back to how do you care for
Both
the
parties.
family too?
How do you navigate that in terms of if the pastor's not present at the event where it's focused on children? Does the pastor inform the leadership, then keep the confidentiality of why this person should not be present at that event? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to.
Yeah.
I would think we'd come under a staff parish relations.
Yeah.
I think that's what we said in our
Okay.
meeting, that we would notify, the pastor would notify the chair and maybe one other person, and then whoever that was assigned to do that.
But again, probably what you would wanna do is say you're welcome to come to worship,
Yes.
but you're not gonna come to the family night supper or
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
That's specifically for kids, yeah.
Yeah,
So have the boundaries in place for he or she ever starts. And they say that he or she, because they're female predators too,
Mhm.
would have to wear a monitor for at least 5 years when they get out. So.
Any other questions or anything?
About the application, if you've had a background check from the county, is that adequate, or do you have to have another one?
That's.
That's
I
what
don't
we've
know.
been doing.
That's
Go to
what
the
we
county.
said, put it
Yeah.
through the county, that's what we're doing.
Eh,
Just go to the county.
Do the county's okay?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's what we've done in the past.
And if you will tell them it's with the church, they will usually just waive the fee.
Yep.
They've waived several that I've sent over there, so if they're working, so there is a fee for a background check, but if you tell them you're doing this for,
Well, we've already, since I've had one, I don't need it.
okay.
Okay. That's good though.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
nice that they waived that fee. Anything else? Well, I didn't get heckled too much from the people on the back. So, thank you all. If you have a question.
One thing I didn't know. I learned one thing I didn't know. I'm gonna have to have an adult with me when I go visit Betty.
That's a looks priceless. He's in trouble.
I don't see any adults in this room.
I needed that all these years.
Did you clarify responsible?
Responsible adult.
Yeah, right, responsible adult, that's for you all to determine. So,
We just take
well,
this to the
Is this a
office,
staff
to the county
person's
office,
use?
right? Yeah. That's all I do. They give it right
Well,
back.
as we close, again, just thank you all for your willingness to not only be here tonight, but to be in ministry. And there's some great things that are happening through this church and through this community, and you all need to celebrate that. That's a wonderful thing. I had the opportunity, I love to go to River of Life at least once every season, and I was there for part of it the other day. I had to leave. But just hearing, and Wayner's always excited about what's happening with Restoration House and everything that's going on. So thank you for being the church and for being a church that joins with other churches and you all can do ministry together. Because that, I will tell you, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen in places. Sometimes people get very territorial, and it's like, let's do church together and reach out and do the good we can for the kingdom. But if you have a question after that you want to ask, I'll hang around for just a minute. But I started off with Scripture, and I want to close with Scripture. And this is from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22, from the Message. So let's do it, full of belief, confident that we are presentable inside and out. Let's keep a firm grip on the promises that keep us going. So go forth and do great ministry. Amen.
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 Thank you.
You know what? Do you need